Okay, we left off talking about these secondary compounds in plants that make them unpalatable to animals, and that, as I said, we have begun to take advantage of as compounds that can be used in medicine. So, as you can imagine, under intense pressure from herbivores, you create the conditions under which you should get the evolution of this plant population, this species. There should be essentially natural selection for types of plants that are able to, one way or another, avoid this herbivory. And so this is an experiment in which they use this plant called Arabidopsis thaliana, which is a very commonly used in plant studies, genetics, and such. It's a weedy little thing, but it grows. It's a pretty small plant and grows easily and abundantly. And so they had 27 different varieties of this plant, and that means basically 27 different genotypes. And there were two different types of herbivorous insects that feed on this, aphids to be precise, that feed on these plants. And so they ran the experiment for several generations of the plants and the aphids as well. And so what they found was that over time, the average size of the plants actually increased. So they were being preyed upon by the aphids, but they increased in size over time. Um, this could perhaps be due to a bit to compensation, the plants sort of becoming bushier, but it could also be due to selection for plants that just get bigger because they're the ones that can tolerate the herbivory more than a small plant, um, less likely to succumb to the herbivory of these aphids. Another thing they looked at was how did the different genotypes of the plants do? And so the tan color and the bluish green color, they represent, again, the 27 different genotypes, but on one side it's a group of plants that have a particular kind of secondary compound, and on the other it's a different kind of secondary compound. And what they found was that some genotypes of plants did better than others. You might say they're not all created equal. Some of the genotypes came to be the predominant genotype in that population after herbivory, and others, in fact, 10 of the 27 completely died out um, when subject to all this herbivory. So that would paint the picture of particular genotypes being better able to withstand this herbivory, and they should then, through natural selection, become the more common ones. Um, but now predators aren't just going to take that. Of course, there will be selection amongst the predators for traits that allow them to continue to get the food they need. Here's a really nice adaptation that some snakes have, and that is they have a jaw that can basically come unhinged, and they can swallow things that are much bigger than their mouth, you might say. And so here's this unfortunate toad being swallowed by this snake, and the toad actually kind of will puff up its body and try to become bigger when it's under attack so that it's harder to swallow, but this snake is making a good effort of swallowing this guy. Um, Now, we talked about with plants using compounds to deter herbivory, but predators also make use of toxic compounds, and here it's to neutralize the prey and make it easier to consume them so they don't struggle as much. And here's a little lesson for you. You can put this in your memory bank in case you're ever confronted with a snake and you want to know whether it's poisonous or not. They generally look for those guys right there. That'll be a good indicator. Now, in addition to prey attempting to blend in. Predators can also use crypsis to try to blend in, and I got this picture off the internet, and I have not been able to find it yet, but on the website it claimed that there's a snake in this image somewhere, a copperhead. Um, Perhaps you'll be better at spotting it than I am, but point is that these predators themselves can blend in and basically wait for something to come close enough for them to take a lunge at it. And indeed, predators as well. Of course, if some prey has certain toxic compounds, you can imagine there'll be selection for those predators who are able to consume that toxin, be able to consume that prey that has that toxin. There's these newts, and so this is an aposematic newt. It has toxins, and it's sort of brightly colored to advertise that. But there are some garter snakes that are able to eat them. Now, this one it's eating here is not one of these toxic newts, but supposedly they can. Now, I put trade-offs here because the garter snakes, when they do eat, the garter snakes that can eat these toxic newts, apparently they become much more lethargic for a time, a period of several hours after this, not only because they've just eaten, because this toxic, they're having to process it, it just slows them down. So they themselves are more susceptible to being preyed upon by something like a bird or something, a hawk or something like that. So when eating the toxic newts, there's sort of a risk they take, you might say. And the same with plants. Again, there are herbivores that are able to tolerate some of these toxic plants more than others. Goats are notorious for being able to eat just about anything, and so they have developed a tolerance for some of these plants that other animals avoid. All right, so the relationships between organisms, between predators and their prey, between herbivores and their plants, these things can have, in some cases, significant effects on whole ecological communities, whole assemblages of plants and animals. And we're going to give some examples. A lot of these examples involve introduced species that have had a significant impact. This is out west, and there's this plant called Klamath weed. I think its other name is St. John's wort, which it has medicinal properties, but it's a weed that can really become infested in some of these grasslands out west, and it's toxic to cattle. And so the ranchers don't like having it around. And you can see it can really take over some areas. Um, and so what was done is this beetle was brought in, and I think the Klamath weed might be a non-native. I'm pretty sure the beetle is. It was brought in um, to control this weed, and you can see, indeed, it does do a good job of that. So here's this weed sort of taking over in the early 1950s, and introduction of the beetle. So the beetle population starts to grow, the weed starts to come down, then the beetle, and so now you're at this new, much lower equilibrium. So the weed is still there, but the insect is able to control it. So that would change significantly this community if this weed is no longer present. Parasitoid wasps have also been used to do the same thing to help control insect pests that have kind of gotten out of control. Um, in the Caribbean, there, of course, are all sorts of these islands. These are relatively low-lying islands with just sort of a shrubby vegetation. And some of these islands have reptiles, have lizards, and some don't. And so the presence or absence of these reptiles can have a significant impact on the community. In particular, they focused in their studies on spiders. And so islands that don't have lizards have relatively low extinction rates for these spiders, but as you can see, when there are lizards present, naturally, for example, you have much higher extinction rates. But then in those islands that don't normally have lizards, when they are introduced, then you get much higher extinction rates, and you could perhaps think of a reason why that is. Again, what do you think? If you're an island and you have types of spiders on there that aren't used to having lizards around, well, if you have lizards all of a sudden, that can be a problem because um, you won't know how to handle that. There's a good example of this on the island of Guam, G-A-U-M, I believe is how it's spelled, in the South Pacific. A lot of these islands do not have, they had no native snakes. And there was this snake called the brown tree snake that was introduced to Guam, and it has had a devastating effect on birds on this island. Many species have gone extinct, and they were species that were only found on Guam. Um, Again, these introduced species can cause problems. Now, this is not an example of an introduced species, but the snow geese, these ones that migrate, they live up north throughout the summertime. They're generally white. Um, they can have significant impacts on the vegetation. They feed in these marshy areas, these wetlands, and here's an example where they had this area that where the geese were excluded from it, and you can see around it they have just basically mowed down all the vegetation. You might say to yourself, well, this is a bird. They could just fly or hop over this thing. Well, they're up north during a part of the year when they molt, and when they molt, they're losing feathers and they can't fly, and they're basically new feathers are coming in, and so that's why they couldn't hop over the enclosure because it was during the molting season when they were doing this. Um, and so here you can see um, the effect that goslings, those are the baby geese, that they have, and that as their time spent grazing, um, it has an impact on the productivity of that system. So with no grazing, you have a certain level of productivity. As grazing increases, productivity increases amongst the plants. That again could be an example of compensation. But essentially, as they spend more and more time grazing areas, they are mowing down so much of the vegetation that then the productivity, the net primary productivity, decreases, again, because of the effect of this grazing. Here's another good example mentioned in the book. The Arctic fox, this predator that lives up north, has an interesting adaptation that in the summertime it has a dark color, but in the wintertime its coat changes to white. The Aleutian Islands are this chain of islands off of Alaska that sort of goes off into the Pacific towards Asia. Um, the fox was introduced to these islands, um, preyed upon a lot of the native small mammals that were on these islands, and um, essentially had a significant impact on this system such that it changed from a grassy area into basically a tundra because of their presence. And here's a link to an article that talks about this that we may um, discuss in class. No, I'm sorry, they weren't preying, I'm looking at my notes, so they weren't preying on mammals, they were preying on seabirds. And so the seabird populations went down. Well, the seabirds, through their guano, otherwise known as bird poop, they were fertilizing the system, and with the lack of guano, there was less fertilizer for the plants, and the plants began to die out. Um, Another example. So here, this golden snail was introduced into these different locations around Southeast Asia, has a voracious appetite, and has had a significantly negative impact on aquatic systems and the vegetation and aquatic system in these areas. So, again, individual species can sometimes have a big impact, as we've seen, particularly when they're non-native. They tend to sometimes have an inordinate impact on these systems.